The Human Cycle by Sri Aurobindo. Chapter 18. The Infrarational Age of the Cycle. At a higher stage of development, or of a return towards a fuller evolution, for the actual savage in humanity is perhaps not the original primitive man, but a relapse and reversion towards primitiveness. The infrarational stage of society may arrive at a very lofty order of civilization. It may have great intuitions of the meaning or general intention of life, admirable ideas of the arrangement of life, a harmonious, well-adapted, durable, and serviceable social system, an imposing religion, which will not be without its profundities, but in which symbol and ceremonial will form the largest portion, and for the mass of man will be almost the whole of religion. In this stage, pure reason and pure spirituality will not govern the society or move large bodies of men, but will be represented, if at all, by individuals, at first few, but growing in number as these two powers increase in their purity and vigor and attract more and more votaries. This may well lead to an age, if the development of reason is strongest, of great individual thinkers who seize on some idea of life and its origins and laws, and erect that into a philosophy, of critical minds, standing isolated above the mass, who judge life, not yet with a luminous largeness, a minute flexibility of understanding, or a clear and comprehensive profundity, but still with power of intelligence, insight, acuteness, perhaps even a preeminent social thinker here and there, who, taking advantage of some crisis or disturbance, is able to get the society to modify or reconstruct itself on the basis of some clearly rational and intelligent principle. Such an age seems to be represented by the traditions of the beginnings of Greek civilization, or rather the beginnings of its mobile and progressive period. Or, if spirituality predominates, there will be great mystics, capable of delving into the profound and still occult psychological possibilities of our nature, who will divine and realize the truth of the self and spirit in man. And, even though they keep these things secret and imparted only to a small number of initiates, may yet succeed in deepening with them the crude forms of the popular life. Even such a development is obscurely indicated in the old traditions of the mysteries. In prehistoric India, we see it take a peculiar and unique turn, which determined the whole future trend of the society, and made Indian civilization a thing apart, and of its own kind in the history of the human race. But these things are only a first beginning of light In the midst of a humanity which is still infrarational, as well as infraspiritual, and even when it undergoes the influence of these precursors, responds only obscurely to their inspirations, and without any clearly intelligent or awakened spiritual reception of what they impart or impose. It still turns everything into infrarational form and disfiguring tradition, and lives spiritually by ill-understood ceremonial and disguising symbol. It feels obscurely the higher things, tries to live them in its own stumbling way, but it does not yet understand. It cannot lay hold either on the intellectual form or the spiritual heart of their significance. As reason and spirituality develop, they begin to become a larger and more diffused force, less intense perhaps, but wider and more effective on the mass. The mystics become the sowers of the seed of an immense spiritual development, in which whole classes of society, and even men from all classes, seek the light, as happened in India in the age of the Upanishads. The solitary individual thinkers are replaced by a great number of writers, poets, thinkers, rhetoricians, sophists, scientific inquirers, who pour out a profuse flood of acute speculation and inquiry, stimulating the thought habit and creating, even in the mass, a generalized activity of the intelligence. As happened in Greece in the age of the sophists. The spiritual development, arising uncurbed by reason in an infrarational society, has often a tendency to outrun at first the rational and intellectual movement. For the greatest illuminating force of the infrarational man, as he develops, is an inferior intuition, an instinctively intuitional sight arising out of the force of life in him, and the transition from this to an intensity of inner life and the growth of a deeper spiritual intuition, which outleaps the intellect and seems to dispense with it, is an easy passage in the individual man. But for humanity at large, this movement cannot last. The mind and intellect must develop to their fullness, so that the spirituality of the race may rise securely upward on a broad basis of the developed lower nature in man, the intelligent mental being. Therefore we see that the reason in its growth either does away with the distinct spiritual tendency for a time, as in ancient Greece, or accepts it, but spins out around its first data and activities a vast web of the workings of the intelligence, so that, as in India, the early mystic seer is replaced by the philosopher mystic, the religious thinker, and even the philosopher, pure and simple. For a time, the new growth and impulse may seem to take possession of a whole community, as in Athens or in old Aryan India. But these early dawns cannot endure in their purity, so long as the race is not ready. There is a crystallization, a lessening of the first impetus, a new growth of infrarational forms, in which the thought or the spirituality is overgrown with inferior accretions, or it is embedded in the form, and may even die in it. While the tradition of the living knowledge, the loftier life and activity, remains the property of the higher classes, or a highest class. The multitude remains infrarational in its habit of mind, though perhaps it may still keep in capacity an enlivened intelligence, or a profound or subtle spiritual receptiveness as its gain from the past. So long as the hour of the rational age has not arrived, the irrational period of society cannot be left behind. And that arrival can only be when not a class or a few, but the multitude has learned to think, to exercise its intelligence actively. It matters not at first, however imperfectly, upon their life, their needs, their rights, their duties, their aspirations as human beings. Until then, we have as the highest possible development a mixed society, infrarational in the mass, but saved for civilization by a higher class whose business it is to seek after the reason and the spirit, to keep the gains of mankind in these fields, to add to them, to enlighten, and raise with them, as much as possible, the life of the whole. At this point, we see that nature, in her human mass, tends to move forward slowly on her various lines of active mind and life towards a greater application of reason and spirituality, which shall at last bring near the possibility of a rational and eventually a spiritual age of mankind. Her difficulties proceed from two sides. First, while she originally developed thought and reason and spirituality by exceptional individuals, now she develops them in the mass by exceptional communities or nations. At least in the relative sense of a nation governed, led, and progressively formed and educated by its intellectually or spiritually cultured class or classes. But the exceptional nation, touched on its higher levels by a developed reason or spirituality, or both, as were Greece and later Rome in ancient Europe, India, China, and Persia in ancient Asia, is surrounded or neighbored by enormous masses of the old infrarational humanity, and endangered by this menacing proximity. For until a developed science comes in to redress the balance, the barbarian has always a greater physical force and unexhausted native power of aggression than the cultured peoples. At this stage, the light and power of civilization always collapses in the end, before the attack of the outer darkness. Then, ascending nature has to train the conquerors more or less slowly with long difficulty and much loss and delay, to develop among themselves what their incursion has temporarily destroyed or impaired. In the end, humanity gains by the process. A greater mass of the nations is brought in. A larger and more living force of progress is applied. A starting point is reached from which it can move to richer and more varied gains. But a certain loss is always the price of this advance. But even within the communities themselves, reason and spirituality at this stage are always hampered and endangered by existing in a milieu and atmosphere not their own. The elite, the classes in charge of these powers, are obliged to throw them into forms which the mass of human ignorance they lead and rule will accept. And both reason and spirituality tend to be stifled by these forms, to get stereotyped, fossilized, void of life, bound up from their natural play. Secondly, since they are, after all, part of the mass, these higher, enlightened elements are themselves much under the influence of their infrarational parts, and do not, except in individuals, arrive at the entirely free play of the reason, or the free light of the spirit. Thirdly, there is always the danger of these elements gravitating downward to the ignorance below, or even collapsing into it. Nature guards herself by various devices for maintaining the tradition of intellectual and spiritual activity in the favored classes. Here she makes it a point of honor for them to preserve and promote the national culture. There she establishes a preservative system of education and discipline. And in order that these things may not degenerate into mere traditionalism, she brings in a series of intellectual or spiritual movements which by their shock revivify the failing life and help to bring about a broadening and an enlarging, and to drive the dominant reason or spirituality deeper down into the infrarational mass. Each movement, indeed, tends to petrify after a shorter or longer activity. But a fresh shock, a new wave, arrives in time to save and regenerate. Finally, she reaches the point when, all immediate danger of relapse overcome, she can proceed to her next decisive advance in the cycle of social evolution. This must take the form of an attempt to universalize, first of all, the habit of reason and the application of the intelligence and intelligent will to life. Thus is instituted the rational age of human society, the great endeavor to bring the power of the reason and intelligence to bear on all that we are and do, and to organize in their light and by their guiding force the entire existence of the race.